Hello, welcome back to Catholic Reboot. Um, now that my consulting practice is finally coming back and heating up, I'm finding I'm getting up earlier in the morning to get some of these podcasts done, which is fun. Which means I got to go to bed a little bit earlier. And I was also told the least I could do is throw on a jacket. Right. Um, okay, so in the previous episode, I had talked about the giants whose shoulders we stand on, right? And I started with John Veneri, and I thought I explained who John was and the things that he had to say, and the great warrior he was for the traditional Catholic faith. This episode is going to be on Michael Davies. Now, sometimes what I find is that I got to slow down because I actually went to the traditional Catholic faith. It's almost close to 20 years now, pretty close to that. And I forget so easily that at one time I was a novice and all I was bringing to the table was the training or teachings I had in the Novus Ordo because I was a child of the Vatican II, right? So as I go through it, I almost have to stop myself and say, well, how would they know what you're talking about, right? Because it took me quite a bit of time to play catch up. Well, the way it works is one thing leads to another. It's just the way it is. And so you'll come across one author, one speaker, one priest, a fellow traditionalist, and it's just this continuous education that you go through. Early in my podcast, I said we really have to stop getting used to our eighth grade level education in our Catholic faith. We really need to be students. And if we don't, well, then the onus is on us. Then we're just choosing to kind of be somewhat robotic in our faith, and it doesn't really much matter. And so be it. I will say that what I felt as I was learning is every time someone taught me something, now I became even more responsible, right? So I apologize if you are actually watching these videos that you may say, hey, enough, because now you're making me responsible to learn more, which is really my intention, because it is a great fever you will catch, and you will just really stop wasting your time in matters that just aren't worth your time. You'll start budgeting time for things like this or further books or documentaries, right? All right, so let's talk about Michael Davies. So Michael Davies was born on March 13th, 1936. He died on September 25th, 2004. And it seems that we lose a lot of these great educators at a young age because he was only 68 when he died, but he lived a full life. He was a British teacher and a traditional Catholic writer of a significant number of books. I'm at the very end of this, I'm going to actually have a placard that's going to list all the books that he wrote. And many of them were geared towards addressing the Second Vatican Council of the Church. I had come across quite a few videos of Michael Davies so that I could share some clips with you so you can get a sense of who he was, his speaking style, some of his points. He was very prolific in his time. I'll tell you how significant he was, is um, on the election of Pope John Paul I, right? So this would have been right after the death of Pope Paul VI. William F. Buckley had him on his show with Malachi Martin, another big name of the time, and a Novus Ordo priest, and I forget his name, but I'll get it up on the screen. And the exchange that Michael Davies had on that show, especially with William F. Buckley, because for many of you who remember him on his program Firing Line, I think it was, he was a tough guy as far as an interviewer, and you can just get the sense that there was a lot of respect for Michael Davies, right? After that, I'm just going to give you other clippets, and the idea of this is to get an understanding of the depth at which he went into researching the Second Vatican Council and the significant errors of that council, right? Now, he was his ethnic was that he was from Wales. Most of his life was spent in England. He was a teacher, like I said. He actually originally was a Presbyterian and he converted in his early 20s, I believe. So here is someone coming from the Protestant faith, and then, as I've seen with a lot of Protestant conversions, they take it on themselves to play catch up and do become very, very strong Catholics. I would say that when I'm dealing with Protestant converts, they do put a lot of Novus Ordo Catholics to shame because they know much more about the Catholic Church, its doctrines, its councils, and its dogma than most Novus Ordo Catholics. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to just show you some clips and then come back in and give you a final say on Michael Davies.
Question of the Pope's theological assertiveness, as we shall see. Michael Davies is a British writer, a convert to Catholicism at age 21, who has written a half-dozen books on Christian and Catholic thought, including most recently an Apologia pro Marcel Lefebvre, a defense, if that is exactly the word for it, of the controversial archbishop who defied Pope Paul VI by presiding over a seminary which clung to the Tridentine Mass, displaced by Vatican II. Mr. Davies is a graduate of St. Mary's College in London and served in the British Army. His first book was CRANMER'S Godly Order, and his upcoming book is called Pope Paul's New Mass. Father Joseph...
I suppose, but it is an implied rebuke because there are many demands that Pope Paul VI should condemn Hans Küng. In fact, the book I wrote before this one, it's one about the priesthood called The Order of Melchizedek. I had a chapter on Hans Küng showing that his theology is completely incompatible with Catholicism, documenting it all from his own books. And I said it was quite scandalous that he should be allowed to continue as an accredited teacher of Catholic theology while Archbishop Lefebvre was suspended. I'm very glad that situation has been put right now. Obviously what I'm hoping now is that the suspension will be lifted from Archbishop Lefebvre and everything will be back to normal.
Well, is it your judgment that that Pope Paul John is bringing the theological house back to order, or is in your judgment, is he up to something that's actually new?
Well, I think Pope, it's John Paul, by the way, Pope John Paul. His theology, I'd say, is virtually identical with Archbishop Lefebvre's. When he was over here last fall, you call it, don't you, in the autumn, as we'd say, he took up every controversial issue within the American church, such as the ordination of women, contraception, abortion, every controversial issue there is, and he came out with a traditional answer on it. In the spring of last year, he came out with a book on the priesthood, which I was very pleased to see. It was all the theology in it was practically identical with the book which I'd written on the priesthood myself. He's now come out with a new letter on the Holy Eucharist, in which he reaffirms all the traditional Catholic teaching that the Mass is a sacrifice, our Lord is truly present, that the priest acts in what we call in persona Christi, in the person of Christ. He condemns practices which are pretty common in America, such as not wearing the proper vestments for Mass, using unauthorized readings. He comes out very strongly in favor of that only the priest should distribute Holy Communion, that extraordinary ministers of communion should only be used in the very rarely if it's needed, and also a practice that's quite common in America, which they call Eucharistic hospitality, allowing non-Catholics to receive communion. He said that the norms, the Vatican has norms for that, they should be adhered to rigidly. So, and I think most traditionalists are very encouraged by that. But where we would have our problem is the traditionalists like myself, our conflict with the Vatican is over matters like the form of the Mass.
Well, heresy is something else. Now, nobody's gotten around, have they, to saying that the Tridentine Mass is heretical?
No, the Archbishop's never been criticized for any of his doctrine. And as you say, Hung, I would agree with you that the situation hasn't changed. Kung's, for instance, his book on infallibility, Kung is an honest man, and he comes out with what he says, and he's straightforward, in a straightforward manner, rejects the doctrine of papal infallibility. In his book, Why Priests? He says that the priesthood wasn't instituted by Christ, that there's no sacred character imprinted at the priesthood. The priest has no powers which ordinary people don't have, that in an emergency a layman or laywoman could preside at the Eucharist. All this is straightforward contradiction of infallible papal teaching. And as you say, he wrote these books years ago. I think the difficulty with Pope Paul VI was he wasn't really willing to go against the spirit of the times. He started off this reform of Vatican II with great hopes. It was supposed to bring about a great renewal, for instance, a great renewal in the liturgy, and it's ended up with chaos. There was to be a renewal in religious life. And in the United States, you've had 50,000 nuns have left their convents, which is a funny sort of renewal. You've had 10,000 priests have been laicized. His policy with the communist world, his Ostpolitik, that turned out to be a disaster. And it's very hard for a person in authority to face up to the fact publicly that everything he's been doing has turned out to be a disaster. And of course, I think Kung was a symbol of what traditionalists call the conciliar church, the Church of Vatican II, much admired by Protestants. As you know, his condemnation has evoked fury from liberal Catholics and from Protestants. Even the Church Times, a very conservative Anglican newspaper, they compare the Pope to the Ayatollah of the West, and they question whether there's any future in the ecumenical movement anymore.
I know that you studied in this book and elsewhere the constitution of the liturgy. Is there anything in the liturgy, for instance, that tells the priest to face the people?
No, it's a point I'd like to bring up. Father says I've been bringing too many things up at one time, so I'd just like to perhaps bring one point for him to comment on. Now, Father is talking here as if the way Mass is celebrated in churches in America today has got something to do with Vatican II, but it's got absolutely nothing to do with the liturgy constitution whatsoever. There's a very well-known priest, you must have heard of Father Louis Bouillet, haven't you? Yes. Well, he wrote a book just after Vatican II called The Liturgy Revived, saying this was the culmination of the whole liturgical movement, what a great renewal and revival was going to come. A few years later, he wrote a book called The Decomposition of Catholicism, in which he said the reform as we now have it is a betrayal of Vatican II and the whole liturgical movement. Now, to come to the specific example I'd like Father to comment on, he said we're going back to the sound practices of the early church, such as Mass facing the people. Well, Mass has never been celebrated facing the people at any time at all in the history of the church under the Protestant Reformation. So this isn't and it wasn't mentioned, there's not one word about it anywhere in Vatican II. There's no suggestion that Mass should be celebrated facing the people. It was just some priest probably thought that this is a sort of trendy idea to do. All the others started copying them. Then you hear all this talk about the great church of the poor, and they must have spent over the world thousands of millions of dollars smashing up beautiful altars.
Let's go back.
He wrote basilicas like St. Peter's in Rome, where the apse happens to be at the west end, so the altar was positioned so that the priests could celebrate Mass facing the east. During the more important parts
St. Paul's outside the walls
yes,
too?
yes, those there was just a few Roman basilicas. During the essential parts of the Mass, the congregation would be on the aisle at each side facing the east. They wouldn't be facing the priest, so the whole congregation would be facing the east. And all the historical, archaeological evidence, there's a Professor Cyril Vogel in a magazine called L'Église de l'Orient. L'Église Syrienne, I think. It was about the Syrian church, and he's gone into this in very great detail. Louis Boyer has written a book on it, and it's absolutely incontrovertible that never at any time in the history of the church has Mass been celebrated facing the people till you came to the Protestant Reformation, and the eastward orientation, that denoted sacrifice. And they said a table is to have a meal upon. They made a table and replaced the eastward position with a position facing the congregation. There's an introduction. There's, I think, probably most people watching wouldn't know, called the General Instruction to the New Roman Missal. Well, when it came out, first of all, you just had the New Order of Mass. You didn't have a complete Missal with all the readings. You just had a New Order of Mass, which had this General Instruction with all the articles explaining it. Some of these articles, they were just totally Protestant. For instance, they explained the nature of the Mass, Article 7. They said it's the coming together of the people under the presidency of a priest, which is there's nothing formally heretical in it, but it's totally acceptable to Protestants. Article 48 said that during the Mass, it was the Last Supper was made present. That is heretical, actually. Well, when the Missal which Father came out mentions with this foreword, that came out in 1970, and the foreword he has mentioned, the premium in Latin, as he said, it states every doctrine of the Council of Trent, absolutely orthodox, in an orthodox manner, and says this is what the new Mass is intended to enshrine. But I think this foreword is the most damning indictment of the new Mass ever published. The fact that within a year of its publication, they had to put an introduction to it, saying, oh yes, well it really is Catholic after all, it really is meant to show this. It's a far more damning indictment than anything traditionalists have written about it.
I'm not 100% sure I follow that. You say it's damning to reiterate the fact that it is dogmatically...
No, the fact that the new Mass was issued in 1969,
yeah,
and it evoked such criticism for its doctrinal inadequacy, which if you like I'll explain why it's doctrinally inadequate in a moment, that when it was republished in 1970, they had to add an introduction
to reiterate its orthodoxy.
Yes, protesting, affirming that it really was orthodox.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well now, do you think, is it your position, Father?
Well, now if you... this book, this Liturgical Revolution trilogy I wrote, I was just intending to write one short thing about the new Mass, and I thought I was doing a chapter about CRANMER'S reform, and it was so interesting, so parallel, that in the end I ended up writing a whole book on that. So I'm pretty well up on that.
Okay, so I want to stop it there and actually just make reference to the fact that I will provide the URL link for that entire interview. I intentionally cut out Father Kaplan's comments because I wanted you to get a sense of what Michael Davies was talking about at that time. Now, what you'll notice is this follows a typical liberal line. What had happened since the release of Vatican II is the church liberals just literally bullied their way through the process with a lot of Catholics. And when those Catholics objected and were questioning the very principles that they claimed they were using during Vatican II, in that it was not a doctrinal or dogmatic council, but a pastoral council, and then later act as if it was, someone like Michael Davies would kind of be the modern Rush Limbaugh of the traditional Catholic faith. He was well educated. He could go up against the best liberals. And if you go back and listen to the entire interview, you'll see Father Kaplan playing those liberal themes, that those kind of making statements but not making statements. And Michael Davies just destroys him, right? Now, why is this important to know? Because what was really important about that interview, and you really should watch it, was that was a very There's a lot of turmoil. It shows creation of the interview in 1980, but in reality, I believe that was right after the election of John Paul the First in 1978. Okay, um, because just some of the references they're making, it doesn't seem like John Paul the First was still the Pope at the time. But in any event, what's excellent about this interview is it's a piece of history, it's a treasure, because Malachi Martin was there, and Malachi Martin does a phenomenal job, either in that interview or a later one, summarizing everything that's going on and being very specific about the failures of Vatican II and the failures of Pope Paul VI and the release of it. So I'm not going to give you any more clips. I was going to give you a couple, but I wanted you to get a sense of who Michael Davies is. And at the end of this, I'm going to put a placard with all the books he wrote. If you can take the time to either read some of his books, which you will be highly educated, he is an excellent educator, but also YouTube Michael Davies. Go listen to some of his talks. He is a great debater. And as you could probably tell, he wasn't taking much of anything. You know, if a comment was made, he jumped on it and he recited facts. He footnotes almost everything he does. So this is another giant, and if you've never heard of him, you need to. All right. So I'm going to keep up with the series, and we'll go on to the next giant after this. Thank you.